Okay, so the recording is starting now. That way you'll have a reference and can be able to go back and listen to it after the fact. So let me go ahead and share the deck. Put in the slideshow mode first. Okay, hopefully you all can see the title page. Someone can give me a thumbs up and let me know if you can see it.
I got it.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much. So lesson 2 is actually going to cover several days. So we have today's class, Wednesday's class, and then also next Monday, because there's a lot of material. But for tonight's class, we're actually going to go through the very first bullet on here, which talks about identify and engage stakeholders. And then you'll have another instructor for Wednesday's class. And then Monday's class, give you all a little break from me since I've done a few of the classes, but hopefully you're finding this information helpful and as you are preparing to take the exam. So the thing we want to talk about here with lesson 2, when we think about identifying and engaging stakeholders, so this is going to cover the people and process domains as part of the ECO that you're learning. And then when we think about the talent triangle, so remember we had power skills, business acumen, and ways of working. This all ties together. And so we'll jump right in. I can get the slide to advance. Okay. So there are 4 learning objectives that are identified on this slide, but for our class, again, we're going to focus on just the first one, define and discuss stakeholders and the most effective ways to communicate with them. And then as you go through classes on Wednesday and then next Monday, then the rest of the learning objectives that are identified here on the slide, you'll cover those in those classes. Okay, so let's dive right in. So when we think about our stakeholders, so every project that we're going to have, you are going to have some stakeholders. And then the main thing that you want to think about when it comes to stakeholders is being able to establish that relationship with them. So you're going to have communication with the team. Some of them are going to be a part of your core project team. Others are going to be on the outskirts of that team. But remember, when I was telling you from the very first class, that communication is going to be the majority of what you do as a project manager, and especially in PMI's world, that's what project managers do. And for many of you that even do project management here in AT&T, communication is a big part of our work and what we do. And so as we start to talk about the project stakeholders, just know that you also, when you get to lesson 4, it's going to circle back and cover some more information about project stakeholders. But at least for now, we're going to get you into this first part of it. And so on this slide here, we see a list of the various stakeholders that you may have on a given project. And these are just some examples. You may have some others. So just real quick to see if people want to call some of these things out. When you think about who would typically be on your project team as part of your project team members, as you look at this list, who would you think would fall into part of your project team? You won't get lose any points for any wrong answers or anything. It's just to have some thought around it and to see what you all think about stakeholders as you look at this list.
We typically involve legal if you're looking for certain stakeholders, like legal.
Okay. Yep, and so we actually don't see them called out specifically on this list, but they could fall under business partners. So depending upon the type of project, or if you were doing a mandate, as an example, you definitely would have legal involved. So yep, for sure. They can definitely be a part of your project team. Who else on this list, as you look at it, would you think would be part of your project team?
Sponsors,
Mm-hmm.
suppliers and contractors.
Right, they could definitely be part of your project team. And what about some that are outside of the project team. They're still stakeholders, but they may not be involved in some of the day-to-day components.
Outside would be government.
Employee.
Mm-hmm.
The
Right.
end users.
So when you, right. So when you think about stakeholders, you're going to have this whole variety of people that could be, considered a stakeholder depending upon what impact that project is going to have on them. And so as we dive more into this material, then you'll see what are some of the things you want to take into consideration as you think about the various stakeholders that we have.
Can we get the
Okay.
definition, Melissa, that was on that
Oh,
page?
sorry. Let me
Thank
go
you.
back. Apologies. Get it to go back. Thank you. I did miss that. Sometimes they're in a different color too. Okay, so stakeholder, an individual, group, or organization that may be affected by, or perceive itself to be affected by a decision, activity, or outcome of a project, program, or portfolio. So remember I was saying with some of the definitions, if you are planning to use flashcards, whatever your study material is, you may want to just add this one to that list of materials that you have. Now I'll try to make sure I remember going forward to not miss those. Trying to get this one to advance. Okay. So stakeholder and communications management. So there are a few things that will be a part of this. We'll have our stakeholder register, the stakeholder engagement plan, our communications management plan, the stakeholder engagement assessment matrix, and then the assessment grids, matrices, and models. And then we'll dev down into these a little bit more. But when you think about, these are just some of the artifacts that we're going to have, and these are things depending upon the complexity of your project. You may use some or all of them. When we have like some of the smaller projects, this process that you go through to identify who all of your stakeholders are may be a lot quicker and a lot less complex than you would be if on a larger scale project. So some of the things that when you're looking at a small project versus a large project, there can be so many more stakeholders when it's the larger project. So remember we had showed that whole list of stakeholders. You could have a project that may have people from all of those lists. There may be some others that weren't on the list, like the one lady who called out legal. And so you may have some legal that are involved in that project as well. You may even want to bring in, if you're doing something similar to another project that took place, or maybe this project is like a part B to something that had already been done. You may pull in some resources from that other team who may have a stake in it, or that client, especially if the clients change. So we'll just think about, some of these things, and then we'll get into more in terms of like, how do you identify the stakeholders and things like that. And as we think about our stakeholder identification, so we want to make sure we identify our internal as well as our external stakeholders, because remember we were talking about on their previous list, it showed government. So that person could be someone where we have to think about regulations. They may not physically be a part of your project, but they are a stakeholder and they have some input into what would need to be done, because a lot of times with some of our government mandate type of projects, you have all these different regulations and rules that we have to follow. There could be fines and things if we don't adhere to what is being asked of us to do. So you want to think about, who all those stakeholders are. We talked about here to check your business case, your business management plan, because that would be one of the first places where you could go to look to see who are some of those individuals that you would need to take into consideration. And again, there could be some internal as well as external. And then in PMI's world, they talk about something called a project charter. Now, I know there was a time when we used to use project charters here. I don't know if any of you are using those in your projects now, but that was really that first opening to getting that project kicked off, and it gave a lot of information about the project, who all of the players were going to be, what are some of the objectives and goals that was going to come out of that. So in PMI's world, the project charter is still something that exists. So remember I was telling you that when you think about this material, you may hear terms and different things that PMI says, but we don't do them today here in our job. So just make sure that as you're learning the material and you're thinking about it, just always remember to keep PMI's view at the forefront and put the AT&T stuff like on the back burner. And so again, we think about, okay, who all of our stakeholders, we want to make sure we're identifying all those individuals. We want to, it talks about this issues log, the change log, requirements document. These are other artifacts that come up in the project that you would be able to use to identify who your stakeholders may be. Now, you may have a certain list at the very beginning, but then as the project progresses, then there may be others that are added or removed. So it's something where you just want to keep, you know, kind of refining your list. And at the bottom here it says to identify them early on to avoid any surprises later in the project, because the worst thing would be to miss a key stakeholder. And now the project is moving along, and now here comes this person who was left out, but they're really important to what needs to be done with that project, and that could cause some problems for you. And depending upon, you know, the project would determine whether or not it's a big issue, is it something you can fix quickly, or is it something that is going to require rework for your project. And so some of the things here that it calls out to think about the relationship. So what's the relationship of the stakeholders to the project? Their interests, involvement, are there interdependencies? What's their influence? And then their impact on the project's success. And if anyone has any questions along the way, please let me know. I don't have a co-instructor for tonight's class, but I will try to keep an eye on the meeting chat in case you all post some questions there. And you're more than welcome to just ask me to stop if you have a question along the way. Otherwise, I'm going to keep moving so we can make sure we get through all of the material, because there is a lot for the class tonight. So now we talk about assessing our stakeholders, and these are some of the things that we need to take into consideration. So the first piece talks about data gathering. We can do this by questionnaires, by surveys, and brainstorming. I'm sure all of you are familiar with brainstorming. That's just a technique where everybody's sitting around just throwing out ideas. There are no right or wrong answers, and maybe someone on your project team may be aware of a stakeholder that you as a project manager are not. And then if there are questionnaires or surveys, so again, you're not going to have to worry about in PMI telling you that, oh, you have to use a certain tool or you have to use a certain type of like PowerPoint or Excel or Word when it comes down to how you gather information. I mean, there can be recommendations on templates and things like that, but you're not going to get something on a test that tells you have to use PowerPoint, you have to use Excel, so you don't have to worry about that. You have some latitude in terms of like some of the tools that you use. So we want to go through our data gathering, and this is where we're trying to identify who all of our stakeholders are, and then you'll have your project team members so you can ask them to help you to determine who those individuals are so we don't leave anyone out. When we get down to the data analysis, so the stakeholder analysis is talking about what are their stakes in the project, right? So remember we had the previous list, interests, interdependencies, you know, what's their impact that they're going to have based on that project. So we want to be able to identify all those individuals, and then we want to make sure all this stuff gets documented. And as we go through some of the slides, you'll be able to see a way on how these stakeholders, there's an example of how the stakeholders were identified and how you can quantify them. And then on the data representation, there's actually going to be some grids and things that you can use. So we have this two-dimensional grid, which kind of breaks down power interest, power influence, and then impact influence. And so some of the things that you want to make sure that you understand, in case some of these terminology and things are new to you, we do have some definitions over here. And let me just click on that now. But just for the stakeholder analysis in general, is a technique of systematically gathering and analyzing quantitative and qualitative information to determine whose interests should be considered throughout the project. So again, who is really going to be impacted by this? It could be internal, it could be external stakeholders, but you just want to be able to make sure that all of those individuals are gathered to the best of your ability. And some of these grids here, and we'll have on the next slides as we go through, you'll see some examples of what they look like. But on this two-dimensional grid, those are good for like small, simple types of projects where you're just trying to identify who those individuals are. 3D grid gets into be a little bit more complex. In this salience model, that is something that's used for some of the larger, more complex type of projects. And then the directions of influence. So what kind of influence does those stakeholders have on the overall project itself? Let me pause for a minute to see if anyone has any questions. Okay. So next one is create the stakeholder register, and then I'll do the definition first. A project document including the identification, assessment, and classification of project stakeholders. And so some of the things that you will be able to use to help you with this. So as on the previous slide, we were talking to our team members, we were trying to make that list, going through that stakeholder analysis, trying to identify who all these individuals are that are going to be impacted by our project. And so we talk about capturing and recording the important stakeholder information. OPAs, remember that term, you'll see that a lot, and PMI uses it a lot. And then we want to say updated, describe the evolving relationship with stakeholders throughout the entire project. So remember I said we would identify some of our stakeholders up front, but then as the project progresses, you may find that there may be some stakeholders that are now need to be taken into consideration, or maybe there were others who are no longer a stakeholder. Maybe they left the company or they're no longer working on the project. And so we just want to make sure that you are taking those into consideration, any changes within the stakeholders. A little bullet here, which is kind of like an important point, contains the information necessary to execute the stakeholder engagement plan. So in PMI's world, as you identify who all those stakeholders are, there are things that as you progress throughout the project that you want to make sure that those stakeholders are being taken into consideration. And then talking about your previous stakeholder registers. And so remember, the stakeholder registers, that's just where you're going to list all of your stakeholders. And maybe you worked on a project before and you've had some of those same stakeholders that are now going to be on your project. So you can always go in and pull other information. That's why OPAs are so important, because when you think about things that the organization has that you can use in your current project, it's always good to be able to have something as a reference, so you're not always starting from scratch. And then it just wants you to remember that it's a public document, so to ensure that the information presented is appropriate. So you think about someone as a stakeholder, if it was someone who you didn't like, or maybe there was something about the person, I mean, you want to be very careful. You wouldn't want to put anything disparaging in your stakeholder register, because that information would be shared. So that's why they just call that out there, just for you to remember that it is a public document. Now on the next slide, we're going to get into what a stakeholder register is and give you an example of it. And again, this is just an example. So if you look at it, I mean, obviously this can be created in pretty much any kind of tool, PowerPoint, Excel, Word. I mean, you can take your pick. And so as we're looking at this, you should have a copy of this in your student workbook. And so that way, if you wanted to make some notes or keep this as a format that you could use even for your current projects here today, this kind of gives you like that view so you can be able to see. So we just have the name of the person. We have their title. We have whether or not they're internal or external, what their project role is, their major requirements, their expectations, and then their influence/attitude. So obviously we know name, that's pretty simple. Title, so what is the title that they have within the organization, whether or not they're internal sponsor or they're external, because that would help you maybe to be able to determine how you're going to communicate with them. What's their role on the project? So you would want to note that too. Each one of these has the role. What's their major requirements? So what would that stakeholder be concerned about? So when you think about major requirements, that's what this is to illustrate to you. So the first one, who's our CEO, he's the sponsor of this particular project. His major requirement is a successful completion of the project. And then for his expectations are on-time completion, successful partnership. And then for influence and attitude, so what is his impact? So what degree of his impact would he have on the project? So with him being a sponsor, it's going to be high. So he's a champion. And so, and as we look down into some of the others, as you go down this list, you have different people, again, what their title is, what their, if they're internal, external, project role, their requirements, major requirements, their expectations, and then influence or attitude. So we have different ones here: champion, supporter, are they a resistor, or are they neutral? So these are just some of the things you can, take into consideration. So again, this is just an example, and the tool that you use to gather this information is totally up to you. Does anyone have any questions about the stakeholder register? It's pretty straightforward, but just want to make sure that if anyone has any questions. Okay. Next, we want to get into know your stakeholder. So go beyond just job titles. And this is something that PMI wants to make sure that you all understand this piece, because sometimes the terminology can be a little bit confusing. So we just want to make sure that you understand this. And it's not always about someone's job title. So in the first one, we talk about power, which is the level of authority. Now, don't think of this as leadership. So the person could be, the VP in their day job. But what PMI wants you to take away from this is what their level of authority is. So it's not the same as thinking of the job title in terms of leadership. So I could be a VP at AT&T. That's my job. That's the job that I have within this company. But when it comes to this project, my power or my level of authority for that project may be different. Does that make sense? I just want to make sure this isn't confusing. Okay. Then we get into interest, right? So one other thing I want to say about level of authority, and it says that it is delegated to the person by a formal means. So in PMI's world, that means that usually that project charter is what has given that person the power, that level of authority. So remember, PMI's world, project manager, we have authority. Most of the people in that type of project-oriented matrix report to the project manager. So comparing that to AT&T, a lot of us are in functional type of organizations. We have supervisors that we report to, but we may be on a project, but we're not reporting to that actual project manager. So the authority, that level of authority is given to the individual charter. For the interest, level of concern about the project outcomes. So then we're thinking about as our stakeholder. So what is their interest in the project? How are they going to be impacted by this project? We think about it both positively, and it could be some negative impact. So if there are going to be some negative things, we want to be able to keep those in consideration also. So it could be what happens if the project isn't a success. We know on the previous chart, the CEO, who's our sponsor, wants a successful completion. But if it fails, then what would be the impact, right? So that's why we want to know all the interests that our stakeholders have. And then the last one here talks about influence, or another terminology is attitude or impact. And then this is this concerns the ability to make an impact on the project or work of the project team. And so PMI is saying you could think of that as high, medium, low, or you can qualify the influences and attitudes. I mean, in that other chart we had called out like resistor, champion, supporter. So that way in that register, we are quantifying and qualifying each of our stakeholders. Okay, and then the last piece, when you think about impact, how much does that stakeholder contribute to our project, right? Are they going to be positive? Is it going to be negative? But we want to make sure we take that into consideration. And then our bullet point down here, tailor our stakeholder assessment to suit the project needs. The goal of this exercise is to facilitate your planning of effective communication with the stakeholders. So again, it's all around communication, all around relationships. So just think about it in those simple terms like that. Communication, relationships. Now, it doesn't mean that everyone's going to like each other personally. That's not what it's about, but we do have to work together, right? We have our stakeholders, and sometimes we have people, and there are things that may come up that will be negative on a project, but as a project manager, we know that we have to deal with that. Any questions on power, interest, influence?
Those descriptive terms like champion, supporter, neutral, detractor, those are like the official definitions PMI would be, or words PMI would be looking for.
So, okay, so this is just an example of what they use in this, in this stakeholder register.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, but
And
like
so,
we wouldn't
yeah.
have to use those exact words like champion, supporter, resistor. That, like, I don't know.
I follow
my
your
questions.
question. Yeah, no,
Okay.
no, yeah, no, I follow your question. So you're thinking of like if we were on a test, is PMI going to ask you a question about what's a champion, what's a supporter? Yeah, no.
Okay.
No, those.
Thank you.
Yeah, those. Yep, you're welcome. That was just how in this risk register, stake risk register comes later. Stakeholder register, that they're using these terms to classify your stakeholders.
Thank you.
The only thing that they say is just use terms that everyone on your team, would understand. And so let's say you decided to use these terms, and you could just explain to the project team the context in which you're using them. So in this particular one, they actually have a couple of people, 1, 2, 3 people that they're calling out as being a champion, and why and this is just example. So if you wanted to use these same terminology, you could. It's just really for you to be able, you and your project team to be able to know who all the stakeholders are, and then what's their role and how they would be impacted.
Got it. Thanks.
You're welcome. Go on to slide 11. So this gets into our stakeholder mapping. So on one of the previous slides, I was talking about those grids, like a 2D grid, a 3D grid. So this one, this 2D model, in looking at 2 dimensions that they're saying to map your stakeholders. We have the power and interest grid, power and influence grid, and then impact and influence grid. And so when you think about power being low up to high, the interest being low and high. So if I had a stakeholder whose power was low and their interest was low, then according to my grid here, then I would want to be able to monitor them. And so this way, again, is how we can more clarify who our stakeholders are, and then think about when we are thinking about those stakeholders, what do we need to take into consideration, right? So on their things when we think about, we talked about power, so that's the actual level of authority. We talked about interest, their concern in the project, so what are they going to be interested in, the outcome of the project, and then ability to influence the project and ability to cause changes to the project. So again, when we look at the grid, we just follow it along. If their power is high and their interest is high, right, then we want to manage them closely. If they're, did I lose somebody? Oh, someone just turned on their camera. Okay. If their interest is high, but their power, is low, so we just kind of follow the grid here in terms of a way for you to be able to quantify those stakeholders. And then there's a 3D model. They call this a cube. So you have power on one side, interest and attitude. It's just another way of taking this into consideration. And what it wants you to do is to place the names on the grid, place the stakeholder on the grid. They don't want you to use names. There's actually another slide that's going to show you an example of a way to do it without putting names. And then use the same quadrant labels, but change the access labels. And then as you're playing around with it, so if I were thinking about my CEO, so where do you think that CEO who's the champion, where would that individual follow on this grid? Where would you think? You think about the power
managed closely.
Right, yep, managed closely, yep, exactly. So really you're just using this to help you to really figure out, okay, how do you want to manage your stakeholders? Okay, good so far. Okay, directions of influence, right? So this is just another way to assess our stakeholders, right? And to really understand those relationships and how they are going to impact our project, right? So when we think about here, we have 4 things we want to take into consideration: upward, downward, outward, and sideward, right? So again, remember I said some of these terminologies are not things we use here at AT&T, but PMI wants you to understand this, right? So these are our directions of influence. So we think about upward, right? Parent organization, our senior management, their business and financial interests. So this could be steering committee, sponsor, or customer organization. Those could be some of the stakeholders that we're thinking about the direction of their influence, right? Upward. Then we have downward, right? In the product hierarchy, our teams are specialists. So the actual project team members contributing their knowledge, their skills, and they could be there temporarily. Outward, this stakeholder group, so the stake in the project, client, end users, external could be, we talked about government, could be some suppliers, if there's other regulations, they have a stake in the project, but usually they are outside of our project team. And then sideward, these are your peers. So peers of the project manager. Could be other project managers, could be middle managers who are trying to get some of the same resources that you're trying to get for your project. So you may have to have some collaboration and maybe have to share some of those resources. I'm sure many of you have seen that here at AT&T, right? We have projects and there's a resource that could be working on more than one project. So we're having to work together as a project manager with other project managers and to be able to, look at those resources. So those are the 4 that we have to take into consideration as we think of our directions of influence: upward, downward, outward, and sideward. Now this is the salience model. Here's more of a direction on this one. So they want you to focus on the product owner role. So most of the time when you think about product owner, that's more in the agile space, if you're familiar with that terminology. And then are they familiar, interested, and engaged enough with the project to make decisions and move the project forward? And the salience model, remember I was saying this is used more in the larger, more complex type of projects. And it's still taking into consideration power, so the level of authority. Remember that's what's been delegated most likely through the project charter. We have the urgency, so the level of required attention and detail. Are there any time constraints? Is it high stakes, meaning we have to get this done because maybe there's some revenue money that we are really thinking that we're going to get from this. Maybe it's something around the holidays, which we get to see that a lot here at AT&T. of when we want to make sure we're getting that out. And so the other thing too, when you think about level of, time constraints and that level of required attention and detail from a communications perspective. So how would we have to communicate that to our stakeholder? And so the product owner, when they was talking about, do they understand the project enough to make decisions and to help move the project forward, that would be part of their role. And then on the legitimacy, so approximate involvement or proximity as applied to team stakeholders, indicating level of involvement with the project work. So again, we want to take into consideration all three of these: power, urgency, legitimacy. And this is mostly, the salience model is mostly used for larger, more complex projects, but it's still thinking of things that we would also look at in a small project, but obviously on a small project, it's a lot less work you would have to do. You probably would have a lot less stakeholders that you have to take into consideration. Any questions on the salience model? Okay, let's keep moving. Stakeholder perceptions. Okay, so they must be holistically understood in customer-centric project management approaches. They could be damaging to the project if they are negative or positive, right? So if you had a stakeholder and they were in that, remember we had the grid and we had a couple of names on there that were detractors, right? So if that person is a detractor, they could impede the success of your project, because again, our whole goal is to deliver this project successfully based on what our project sponsor had said that was their number one priority and requirement for us to do. But if we have these detractors, then we know that we have to make sure we understand what is it that's making them a detractor. Can we turn that group of detractors around, right? So we do want to hear them out, understand what they have to say, because they're still an important part of the project and they may be a key stakeholder. On the flip side, if someone is overly positive, everything is just perfect, working, 100% of the time, we'd want to be concerned about that too, right? Because we all know nothing is perfect, right? So if someone is telling you that everything is perfect and they may be overestimating the success or that we're having. So you want to think of it from both extremes. If someone is negative or if someone is positive, and remember, this is all around your stakeholders and their perceptions, you just want to make sure that you're looking at it from both sides, right? Because if they're, like I said, overly positive, that could be the wrong perception. And who are they telling them that everything is overly positive? And you're the project manager, and you know there are some things that are going wrong. So you want to make sure that misinformation is not getting out there. Has anyone ever had a situation that you've worked on a project with someone who was totally like overly positive and was giving the wrong perception of your project maybe to others? Or if they were overly negative?
I've definitely had someone who was overly negative. I've had that experience.
Yeah, I think we tend to see more of the negative things than we do of the positive things, right? But then I'm sure it took a lot of energy from you to have to go and now try to negate some of what they're saying.
It sure did, and that's why it's so memorable.
Right.
I got one of them too. It's like, oh yeah, just had an old flashback.
Yes, right. The joys of project management, right? But we know that we have all kinds of people that we have to deal with. People have different personalities, different backgrounds, and so we're the project manager, so we have to be able to work with everyone, right? Doesn't mean we're going to go out to happy hour or anything like that, but we all have to work together. We have to have the success of the project, and if everyone is having some fun along the way, I just think that's positive if we can do that too. All right, thank you both ladies for your feedback. Appreciate that. Now we want to capture our stakeholder feedback and then the perceptions. And so there are a number of things that as a project manager, so again, it's all about, communication. And so we are thinking about what are some of the things that we would need to help us to be effective. So interpersonal skills, active listening, emotional intelligence, effective communication methods. And there's all kinds of ways that we get to communicate, right? So we have our key stakeholders, interview to understand the project requirements, vision, and communication preferences, right? So if you can, anytime you can meet with somebody face to face, I always think that's positive, right? Because as we're talking like now, we're doing this class, we're virtually, but if we were doing this in a classroom setting, remember how back in the day, and sometimes we get to go to leader-led classes where you're still in person, so it's different when you can actually see people. So if this is one of your key stakeholders, and if you can't do it when you're physically together, then you can always do video, right? And to be able to, talk to the person and make sure you understand and that they understand too what's going on with your project and make sure you're all in line, right? Then it talks about all stakeholders, appropriate regular project communication. So as a project manager, you may have a weekly project meeting. You may send out a status report, and that'll go to all of your stakeholders. So you're not going to necessarily meet with them face to face, but you will have some type of regular communication is what their PMI is expecting that you're going to do with your project team and all of your stakeholders. And then the last one talks about large and public groups. So you may use questionnaires or surveys. You can have facilitated conversations. Those could be either in person or online. In our space, and I think in a lot of companies, we're all used to working in this virtual world. We have Teams and there's other tools that we use, and people are quite effective doing that because we have been doing it for so long. I think if you're fortunate enough to have your team members co-located with you, and I know that was the whole thing about RTO, trying to get people back in in the workspace, working together. Obviously that's a big plus if you're able to do that, but most of us are still working in that virtual space. And when you're looking at this last bullet here that talks about the large and public groups, so that's a lot more people. We have our digital media, which could be email campaigns, as websites, group chats. We do use MS Teams here. I know other companies use MS Teams in their ways so you can set up group chats and things in there. And then we have posters and in advertising. But this is all around being able to make sure that our stakeholders, that we're getting their feedback, we're getting their perceptions, and these are just some of the things that we would do and how we could use that. And then to help to be able to see, are we being successful? So now that we are finding out what is important to them, and then that's helping us to be able to deliver the project, right? So if I were going to send out a questionnaire to a large group of people, I would more than likely, I would send it out. I would put some kind of date on it when I would want to get that feedback back from them so that then I can analyze it and then determine, do I need to make some changes, within the project, right? When we think about geographically, the people that we work with, maybe they're in different time zones. So even now on this call, I'm in California, somebody else may be, in New Jersey, New York, you may be, in St. Louis. I mean, so we're dispersed all across, the different time zones. And so doing something like a question or a survey might be a good way to get input from people of a large group versus just, like small group where you can maybe sit down with somebody. Okay. All right, so we got our stakeholder feedback. And then let's see what's next. Okay, how are we going to communicate with our stakeholders? And we have a definition. So we have two things. Our stakeholder engagement plan. This is a component of the project management plan that identifies the strategies and actions required to promote productive involvement of stakeholders in a project or program, decision-making, and execution. It's used to understand stakeholder communication requirements and the level of stakeholder engagement in order to assess and adapt to the level of stakeholder participation in required activities. That's a lot, right? So, but we know that this is going to help us so we can manage all around our stakeholders and how we're going to keep them engaged. And then our communications plan is a component of the project, program, or portfolio management plan that describes how, when, and by whom information about the project will be administered and disseminated. So think about our stakeholder register, right? Where we went in and identified all of our stakeholders. So we could include that as part of our stakeholder engagement plan. So anything that we can pull together that would help us to understand who our stakeholders are and then how are we going to manage them going forward. And then obviously with our team, as well as all of our stakeholders, we're going to have that communications management plan. So those are a couple more definitions that you would want to add to your study material so that you will understand what each of these are, the stakeholder engagement plan and then your communications management plan. Any questions on either one of these? I know the first definition is really long and just trying to really, understand them in terms of you're in like the exam. So if you were to see questions about it, then you just want to understand what does a stakeholder, engagement plan do versus your communications management plan. But these things, they all work together because you still have to communicate to your stakeholders as well. Communication requirements analysis. Okay. So this is something where you'd want to talk to your stakeholders directly about what are their communication requirements. Because if someone were to tell you, and they're a key stakeholder, if they told you that, I don't want you to send me an email, I want you to send me a PowerPoint presentation. Now, if this is your sponsor and your sponsor has told you that this is what they want, then you more than likely would want to be able to make sure that you were sending them their PowerPoint update, that you're not sending them this in email, because they're telling you how they want you to communicate with them. Now, if you have 50 people on your project team, so if it's something that's very complex, obviously you don't want to have 50 different communication methods. So that's why it's important to identify the stakeholders. And when we talk about influence and interest, so if it's somebody who has high interest, high influence on your project, you may do some other things for that particular stakeholder versus someone else who maybe is external to the project where you're not going to go to that level. So that's why you want to understand, and that's why you want to ask the stakeholders directly about how they want, to be communicated to. And then we get into what type of, how we're going to do it, what technology we're going to use, the frequency. Do they want you to give them a weekly update? Is it a bi-weekly update? Is it a monthly update? So depending upon where you are in the life cycle of your project, there may be some differences in terms of when and how you want to communicate with your stakeholders. So it may not be a one size fits all. And then the last piece talks about output is a grid questionnaire or survey that documents the communication and technology requirements for each stakeholder. So think about your stakeholder register when you identify each person, what their role is, their title, what their interest level is. So you would do something very similar for the communication plan. So as you're trying to identify each of the stakeholders and then how you're going to communicate with them. And then you'll be able to determine how many different communication methods you may have. So hopefully, again, even if it's a complex project, you're not going to want to have 50 different communication methods that you're going to do, but you may see a trend as you're talking to your stakeholders and what type of things that they would like to be able to see. Make sense? We good so far?
Yes.
Yes.
Makes sense. It does.
Okay, good. I just want to make sure that I'm not, glossing over anything too quickly, or if there are any questions that you have. I always want to make sure that I can, address your questions, because my goal for you out of all of this, when you finish all of your training, is to take that exam and pass and to get your PMP certification. So that's what this, yes, woohoo! Then we can say, where's the party? Okay. So now we get some more into the communication, the methods and technologies. And again, some of this may be determined by your project. So again, if people are co-located or not. So meetings being meeting/verbal, physical, face-to-face. Obviously, that's a really good way if you can have face-to-face meetings. Virtual video conferencing, we are no stranger to this. Many of our calls are done, just like our training right now is being done over this video. Well, we're not using video, but it is virtual. But we could use video if we wanted to. Or you pick up the phone and call someone, right? Sometimes I wonder why people don't. It's like, we work for the phone company, right? We can actually pick up the phone and call somebody. But then you think, well, if I call them, they're probably already in a meeting, so they aren't going to answer the phone anyway. So, but it is an option, right, to be able to pick someone up and, pick up the phone and talk to someone. In terms of some of the digital and electronic media, we have websites, social media. For those of you who are really into social media, you have so many different platforms that we can use. We do have restrictions here in AT&T depending upon what business unit that you're in. So you may find you're in a business unit where you don't use certain types of things, but we do have, social media is an option. So in PMI's world, instant messaging, text messaging. So we do a lot of that. We have our MS Teams, emails and faxes. I know I spend a lot of time in email jail, so it's not always the best way to communicate with me, but others may really like, email. I don't know how many people have used the fax lately, but it's still a communication method. Who uses fax a lot? Let's see if anybody knows. When you think about fax, think of someone who uses fax.
The government?
I'm sorry.
Thanks.
Who else? Who do you go to visit when you're not feeling good?
Oh, the doctor.
Yes, doctors. Doctors still use fax a lot. And so it really does depend on the industry and things that you're in, and the project could really determine which of these communication methods you would use. And then the physical piece on the bottom just talks about body language, gestures. We can have whiteboards. So now if we were on video and we were doing this conference, we could see each other. So if I said something to you and it didn't make sense, and if I saw like a blank stare on your face, that can let me know, okay, but what I said just didn't make sense, or do I need to go over it again to make sure I understand? So because I don't physically see you, that's why I'm asking questions back to you, so that you can give me feedback so that I know, okay, this is making sense to you, or if it's not making sense, then we can go back over it again, because I don't want anybody to walk away and then have some questions. Okay. And the other group that uses fax, illegal, that's another group that uses fax. But most of us are into that email and texting, chat types of space right now. Next piece we talk about is the communication method. So you can either have a push scenario or a pull scenario, right? So when you think about push, this is where the sender determines, how am I going to send that information to my stakeholders or my project team members? I can send you an email, I can make a phone call, right? If I am the receiver, so I'm pulling the information, that means I'm the recipient, and then I can determine how do I want to get that information. So if it's on like a team board, and we do have team boards in MS Chat, if it's in some kind of a repository, so this is me, I'm the project manager, I'm putting this in like SharePoint, I'm putting it in MS Teams. Now my team members, my stakeholders, they can go and pull that information, right? So they can go to MS Teams, download it. If I posted a document out there, they can download it. They can do it whenever they want to. There's no particular time frame. I don't have to tell them, oh, I need you to pull this, unless there was some kind of time constraint on the message itself. But for the most part, this is just ways for me to put information out there and then how the project team, the stakeholders can go and then get that information. So we talked about conversations being in person or virtual. We do workshops. You know, we hear collaboration really is a big buzzword now, especially since RTO and trying to get people to come back and working together. Whiteboarding, if you were in a conference room, most of them do have actual physical whiteboards that you can write on, or in chat, or in this Teams, even in this tool, you can have a whiteboard and people can put information on there. And then this last piece talks about agile teams, where you try to have them co-located together, because when you think about agile teams and how they work and how they're constantly delivering functionality in like 2 to 3 week windows, when the teams are together, they can collaborate a lot more. You have daily stand-ups, you know, versus when you're in that legacy type of waterfall environment. So any questions here on push versus pull? Okay. So communication challenges and considerations, right? So these are some of the things that PMI wants you to think about, right? The urgency or need for information. So really, how quickly do I need to send it, right? Where does it need to go? So the project manager, that may be something that you would have to think about. The availability and reliability of the technology. So does everyone have access to the tool that we're using? Is it easy to use? Is it widely spread? So we know like MS Teams goes across our entire organization. But what if we were in a team and everyone didn't have MS Teams? Then you wouldn't want that to be your only method of communication, because now someone is being left out and they aren't going to get the information that you're trying to disseminate to the team. So you just want to think about that. And like right now, you know, if my VPN went down, then I wouldn't be able to use my laptop, right, to be able to access MS Teams. But if I had a chip inside of my laptop where I could use the cellular network, then I would still be able to, you know, teach the class. So when you think about, you know, technology, you know, you just want to keep that in mind. Again, how easy is it to use? You don't want something that's so overly complex that no one can understand it. The project environment. So this talks about language and, you know, formality. So how formal is your project? Oftentimes when something is very complex, you'll find there's a lot more rigor and controls put in place. Remember, we talked about some of that in lesson 1. The sensitivity and confidentiality of information. So many of you may be on this call. I know I have worked on NDA projects. So there's certain protocols and things that we have to follow. And so we just want to make sure that we are taking those things into consideration. If it's overly sensitive information, we just want to, you know, be careful on how that's being communicated. So our communication OPAs, remember I talked about social media, how some business units may not allow you to use social media, Facebook being a prime example. You know, it could be blocked. If you try to go out to Facebook from our AT&T network, you probably wouldn't be able to get out. You may have tried to get out to a site that came back with a blocked message that security didn't allow you to go out there. So you just want to take that into consideration. Data protection laws and regulations. So remember we talked about mandate type of projects. There's a lot of government oversight involved in that, regulations. What are things that we have to take into consideration? We have rules around CPNI here with our customer proprietary network information, what things we can and cannot you know, say or do. So we just want to take that into, keep that in, you know, into the back of our minds too. And then our accessibility requirements. So as we think about people with different disabilities, we want to take that into consideration as we are designing things. We always have to take into consideration like colors, right? We may think, oh, I can see the color, but what if you were colorblind? Then you wouldn't be able to see certain colors. So there are just things like that that you want to take into consideration and as you think about communication. Any questions or comments on any of these things? Yeah, I think that was pretty straightforward. So we are winding down. We only have a few more slides to go through. We have a definition here on our communication model. It is a description, analogy, or schematic used to represent how the communication process will be performed for the project. So in this example here, this is a cross-cultural communication model. And then we have our current emotional state. So culture, right? Generational, national, professional, discipline, and gender, personality biases, and assumptions. So our company is very large. It is definitely a generational, multinational corporation, right? We have people from all walks of life. And so as we have our project, we have to think about this in terms of the communication model. We all have biases. I mean, everyone does. It just depends on what those are. And then this model is just really telling you how, as you step through this, like from the sender's point of view and from the receiver's point of view, right? So as we take into consideration all these various things, right? So I could send out an email. In my mind, I already have thought about, okay, what is the message that I want to convey to my project team, right? And I'm sure many of you have probably gotten emails and you wondered, what was the person thinking when they sent that email out, right? Maybe something, let's say if it wasn't grammatically correct, well, maybe the grammar is different because maybe English is not their first language, right? Or if it was something you were doing it in Spanish, if Spanish isn't the person's first, language, and they may not understand it in Spanish. We get lots of acronyms here at AT&T, and I'm sure you've all probably have heard of an acronym or seen an acronym in a document wondering what is it. So we just want to try and make sure that we kind of limit those things. And these things here, when we talk about like some of the noise around the message and what could that noise be. So if we think about some of the assumptions that people make. So if I sent the message, I'm hoping that when I'm sending it to you and it's going across whatever medium that I'm using, now you, the receiver, you get it, and now you are decoding that message that I just sent to you, and hopefully it's coming across in the way that I'm hoping as the sender that it's going to come across, right? But when we think about all these things here, and you see it on both sides, so you have it on both sides of the equation, from the sender's point of view, from the receiver's point of view, and then we just, and really this is just wants you to think about the message as it's going out. So this is just some of the things that you would think about. If you were sending out a message that was highly technical, but your audience isn't technical, then what do you think would happen? So I'm the sender, I send out this message, it's going across whatever medium I decided. I'm using email or I posted something in MS Teams chat. The receiver gets the message and they're thinking, what is she talking about? They don't have any idea because it's highly technical, right? So I didn't take into consideration that all of my stakeholders, and remember we have a whole list of stakeholders, that when they got that message, that they were going to understand what it is I was trying to say to them. So that's really what this is trying to convey to you. Is that think about some of these things here, and you have it on both sides, as the sender and as the receiver, and then as you're sending message, because you really want to cut down, on some of the noise that could be in the message. Does that make sense? When you think about communication and when you're sending out messages? And a message, it does, it could be email, it could be MS Team chats, it could be something in social media. I mean, the format that you use in terms of the tool to get the message out, but it's just to be able to represent how you're going to communicate on your project and some of the things you want. And this whole piece here, we talked about noise, this is all subjective, right? Remember they say beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So you have this noise here, the noise that I may have as a sender could be different from the receiver. And there's a lot of soft skills that comes into play here, right? Does this make sense? Any questions on this?
I think it makes sense. I would say that it's equally as important for your acknowledgement of message from the receiver back to sender, right? I mean, especially if you're the project manager and you're communicating a lot, you want everything to be clear from your perspective. But if you have stakeholders that are critical to your success, you also have to understand what they're telling you, right? So I
Right,
it's
right.
I think it's interesting that the bottom part for feedback is one way.
Mhm. You're right. You're right. That in this particular model, they right, they just have it one way. But here on the top, as me as a sender, I send it. The receiver gets it, and then they send it back to me. But then here, I think what they're really trying to say here is like on the feedback, so that the person who's receiving it maybe is giving some additional feedback. I mean, an acknowledgement could just be, okay, I got your message. Yep, I received it. But all that's telling you is I received it, right? That didn't tell me that you understood what I was trying to say. But
I
on
agree.
the bottom part here, you're giving me some feedback to say, yep, Melissa, Tony is saying, Melissa, you sent me this message. You have so many acronyms in here, and there was no explanation of these acronyms. So what is it that you're trying to tell me? That's feedback that I would need to know as a sender, right? Because if I just gave this highly technical message to you, it's coming over as gibberish. It's like basically, when you talk to your kids, remember Charlie Brown? They go blah, 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 blah. Parents talking, or the adult is talking, it went through one ear and out the other. So they weren't really paying attention. And as project managers, we want people to pay attention to our messages, right? We don't want, because it could be something that's really important. So that's why this comes into play. Okay, now we get into our stakeholder engagement strategy, right? So we've already talked about how we've identified our stakeholders, we've identified their influence and interest in our project. We want to keep them involved all throughout the life cycle of our project. So based on the information that they have told us and that we have gathered as part of our stakeholder engagement plan, right? So how are we going to keep them involved, right? Sometimes, when people, like you have a couple of people here with their arms closed, and sometimes they say, well, if you're sitting there with your arms closed, are you being receptive to the information that's going out? Well, if you could see the person, then maybe if that's the vibe that you were getting from them, you would be able to see that. But if it's virtual, you won't be able to see it. But the whole point about this is that we've gone through all this work to identify our stakeholders, and now we just want to make sure that we keep them involved, that we are really working on that relationship, right? So that we know who they are, we know what they want, what they need, we know how to communicate to them, and then hopefully that will help us to be successful as we are trying to deliver this project. Remember, we're keeping them engaged. Now, we identify them at the beginning. So remember, early on it said do it as soon as possible, but we know that stakeholders could change as the project progresses. So that's why we just want to keep this at the forefront to know that we do have these stakeholders and we want to make sure we are meeting their expectations. Okay. We are coming down to the wire. This is our last, our next to last slide, because the last one's just a wrap up of the topic, but this is an example of a stakeholder engagement assessment matrix, or a SEAM. So we have a new acronym here. And what this one is going to depict here for you, so we want to tailor labels for stakeholder level of engagement to your context, team, or organization. And the key thing they point out here is you don't want to use names, right? So you want to give them numbers. And then the idea is that you would be going in here and populating this matrix with a C for current level of engagement, or a D is this desired engagement level. So if I knew number one was a champion, so maybe that was the CEO who was the sponsor. And then we could go in here. I'm hoping that as my sponsor, that I would be able to put a C in the leading, and hopefully a C in supportive, right? Because I want that person to be truly engaged. But let's say my stakeholder wasn't. Maybe they are supportive, but maybe they aren't leading. So maybe I'd put a D over here for my stakeholder, right? A D in leading or C. And I'm just making this up again. So this is just another tool for you to use to help you identify your stakeholders and then just their level of engagement, right? So you would just use this grid. And then again, the key here was to you only use numbers, you don't want to use names. And I guess that's the way to help keep it, especially since a lot of these documents are public. So if you would hate to have a name of your stakeholder and then to say that they were unaware, right? Or maybe if someone was resistant, they maybe didn't want you to call them out that they were resistant in a big forum. So if I came and said, oh, Carla is on, she's one of my stakeholders, and if I had her down as my number 2 and I'm saying she's unaware, so that's my desired level of engagement for her. But then Carla may see that and go, what do you mean I'm unaware? I attend your project status calls, I'm reading, all the communications that you send out, so you can see how that might create some negative conflict. So I think when you just have numbers, it keeps it, in a way that you can view this publicly. You can do it across, your project team with your stakeholders, but it's not pointing anyone out specifically. Okay. All right. So in this part of our lesson, these are some of the things we learned, and these are the references here that you can find more information in the PMBOK. So how we collaborate with our stakeholders, how we engage our stakeholders, and then how we manage our communications. So again, you're going to get more information on lesson 4 around stakeholders, so you'll be able to come back and revisit some of this. But from a more detailed, if you want to really get into this some more and just go and look into your PMBOK, hopefully you all have access to the PMBOK, and these references will be able to help you to find that information. And that's it for our class tonight. We got through all of the materials. If anyone have any other questions, comments, anything that you would like to share? All right then. Well, on Wednesday's class, you will continue with the lesson 2. So again, it'll cover some of the other, we went to that first slide with the objectives. So you'll get into forming the team, building shared understanding, and it'll end with determine your project approach, which will go into next Monday's class. So I just wish you all the best as you are continuing with your studies. Just remember, keep your PMI hat on. If there's anything that I can do to help you throughout your lessons, I'm more than happy to do that. And I hope that you all have a great rest of your night or afternoon, in case if you're out here in the West Coast with me. So thank you all so much. I really appreciate your feedback and being attentive in class. And again, especially the East Coast people, go have some dinner and have some fun. Thank you all.
Melissa. And we
Thank
appreciate
you.
your
Welcome.
efforts.
Thank you,
Thank you so
Melissa.
much.
Melissa.
Have a good
Oh,
evening.
you are welcome.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thanks, you too. You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.